Putin gave a very interesting, a very important speech to the Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. And it was mostly about Ukraine. And what he did is, again, he's repeated the conditions that he had set out in June of last year. The four oblasts, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, plus Crimea, those are Russian territory. And that's over. That's settled. None of this is negotiable. No NATO, and also no banderism. That's the so-called denazification. All that has been restated consistently. There's no sign that the Russians are budging on this. And in fact, this time, this is the important thing, that he added some new conditions. I mean, that he said, okay, yeah, we're going to take those four oblasts. But not only that, we need recognition, international recognition from them. The U.S. must recognize them as Russian territory and Ukraine. And if they don't, and we're not going to wait forever, we're only going to give them a relatively brief period of time. We're not going to say, well, maybe 5 years down the road. But, if you don't do this within a brief period of time, we're going on. And we're going on to Odessa and Kharkov. So he said it. We've been wondering about that. There have been hints of that, but this time he laid it out. So he's actually even firmed up the threats. He's not going in the opposite direction. I think, they're obviously allowing the Ukrainians to get away with bloody murder on this energy infrastructure ceasefire. I think that's purposeful. It makes a lot of Russians mad, and I understand that. But I think it is, the Russians' leadership is calculating that this is going to, again, maybe open the eyes of the Americans. There's some reason to be, again, hopeful about these people, about the American negotiators.
Do you think that the U.S. would officially recognize those four oblasts? Would they do that?
I don't know. I think it would be very hard I think part of the problem too is, I'm not sure exactly what, but a lot of these agreements require, according to the U.S. Constitution, Senate ratification, and generally by a 2/3 majority. And I don't think that's possible right now. So I think it's, even if the administration goes out on a limb and does it, and that's within the realm of possibility. Again, we've heard these things, encouraging statements, not just one or two, but now, kind of accumulating number of statements that there is kind of a growing understanding within the administration of Russia's position. But, that in the end, they're going to have to, well, first of all, it really would be a firestorm. And especially if Trump just might decide it's not a fight that he wants to fight, but it's hard to predict anything about Trump. But even if he does, decide that, okay, we got to do this, bite the bullet, accept it. This is the only way to end this conflict. I think the Senate will prevent him from actually, officially recognizing those territories.
Yeah, I think it'd be very difficult. I mean, we already hear the screams of capitulation and appeasement and comparing him to Neville Chamberlain all over again. If he does this, you think those screams, those intensify 100-fold.
Right.
And it's interesting they say it needs Senate ratification, because it feels like with the United States, we kind of pick and choose due process, like what requires congressional approval, what requires Senate ratification. Apparently we're allowed to bomb countries and, impose tariffs or do anything like this with executive orders. So I sometimes I wonder, like, do these things even hold things up? I don't know how much of a legitimate process we have in our government anymore. It seems like we're moving slightly more and more towards authoritarianism in a way as well. So
yeah, good point. But the Russians might demand it if they know that really, according to U.S. law, Senate ratification is required. They might demand it because they understand that, okay, well, Trump's term's going to end in 4 years, and who knows who's going to be there. It's like, I think there's at least a 50-50 chance it's going to be a Democrat, even though they're so unpopular, because there is a real chance that the economy could go south. And again, people vote their pocketbooks. And then if if it was just Trump's word or, an executive order on the part of Trump, that can be easily done, on the first day of the new president's term. So, the Russians might demand, even if the U.S. is not willing to abide by its own constitution, the Russians might demand that it do so.
So everything you're saying is telling me that this war is going to continue, that likely the Russians, they didn't give a deadline, right? They didn't say how long until, we need to have some type of international recognition of these roadblocks.
Right. But I think Putin just implied that it's not going to be, it's relatively urgent. It's something that it needs to be addressed right away, that the Russians just can't wait around definitely for years, it's just, so I don't think he actually set, a deadline, but he implied that, the Russian patience is limited.
So this probably means then you think Odessa, Kharkov, these places will likely be next, that we will continue. I mean, what do you think of the likelihood of a complete and utter destruction of Ukraine, complete occupation, if they have to keep moving forward? The further west you go, the less likely those people are going to be willing to agree to anything,
Right.
So it's just
no, it'll be a mess. No, there is, like I say, with regard to the conflict in the Middle East, I don't see a happy ending. But I think you could say the same thing about Ukraine, but actually. Well, compared to the Middle East, it would be pretty happy, relatively speaking. I don't see it ending, because at least on the Russian side, the Kremlin will not be in flames. That will not happen. I think the Russians will achieve their goals. But whether they decide to go all the way to the Polish border, or if they stop, let's say, at the Dnieper in the north, and then Odessa, Nikolaev, and maybe, on to Transnistria in the south, whether they settle for, let's say, the predominantly Russian parts of the country, or they actually go all the way and take all of Ukraine, it's going to be, Ukraine will be a festering wound either way. If they leave Western Ukraine in the hands of the Banderites, it's going to be a country that is still dedicated to the destruction of Russia, and it will have willing supporters in Europe. And maybe they can't. I don't think they can ever actually threaten Russia's existence, but there will be terrorist attacks. There will be, it'll never end entirely. Anybody that's within missile range of Ukraine is going to have to, just live with that uncertainty, even in Russian territory. But then if they do go all the way to the Polish border, then they'll have to deal with an insurgency. I think there's just no question about it. If they stay within the Russian-speaking areas, they don't. We've seen that, actually. Again, in the Don, there is no insurgency. There are the occasional, unfortunately, in the past, rather frequent assassinations that were carried out by Kiev, and Kiev has actually admitted to that. I think Budanov admitted to that not too long ago. But then you would have a real insurgency on your, if you go to the West, you'll have a real insurgency on your hand. That's the sad truth. So either way, it's ugly. I mean, it still will be better than what we have, I think. Definitely. I mean, you're not, maybe at least 1,000 people, 1,000 soldiers are dying every day. That count's going to go way down, but there will be this festering wound. The violence won't stop completely. And there's always a potential anyway, for an outbreak of war. Though I think, again, if the Russians take, especially if they take Odessa, if they take all the Black Sea coast, and then Ukraine is just a landlocked country, it's going to be much less of a threat. Part of the problem, of course, has been this access to the Black Sea. they have been able to attack Russian ships with some effect. And that's just the new technology of warfare. Ships are a lot more vulnerable than they used to be, but they won't be able to get their drones, launch their drones from the coast anymore. It'll be virtually impossible for them to do that. So that, it does reduce the threat to Russia, but it doesn't eliminate the threat to Russia entirely. If they attain the objectives that Putin has set out as the next stage, if the other side doesn't accept his current proposal.
What would you do?
I think I would be very reluctant to go into Western Ukraine. Maybe I'm just a softie. Some people like Mark Sloboda said, he says, yeah, it's terrible, but you just have to do it. The only way to really end this is just to to go in and kill the Banderites. These people are just never going to stop fighting. And I don't have the stomach for that, but I'm not presidential material. I just don't know what the right thing to do is.
Yeah, it seems a bit extreme. I mean, that's a dangerous path to say you have to root out all of the Banderites, because you have this problem where doing things like that can generate more. This is. I think that you have to, if you get international recognition and it diplomatically, don't overreact. And I think that's what's great about Putin, is that he is slow, he is cautious, he is firm. I hope he doesn't go all the way to the Polish border, because I think that, like you said, I think that will be a mess, and I think that will open up a whole other can of worms that they don't want to deal with. But
yeah, well, I think people look at maybe World War II and it's just a total victory by the Allies over the Axis powers, and say and they really did destroy, let's say, fascism in those countries. They were able to uproot it, but there's at huge human cost, of course. But also there's a difference. If Russia goes to the Polish border and, they violently suppress an insurgency, which again, I think would be very costly to them too, and maybe not particularly popular within Russia. The problem is that this country, this Western Ukraine, the rump state that would, that they would be in control of, is surrounded by, or not entirely surrounded, but nearly so, by hostile powers that would, this is when Germany was finally defeated, there weren't any, powers hostile to Russia is what I say, but powers friendly to the insurgents. Mm-hmm. And you didn't have anything like that in Germany, right? So when Germany was defeated, it was utterly defeated. There was no power elsewhere in Europe that would support them, but you would have much of Europe still supporting this insurgency. So even if the Russians marched to the border, there would be a constant problem of, with insurgents crossing the border and receiving arms shipments. And I think it would be a mistake. And
right.
I don't think Putin would do it. I think that, he's shown a reluctance to, again, he's a cautious man, but when he makes a decision, he's been a real decision. He's firm about it. And, we've seen that with that statement he made back in June. He's held to it, and now he's actually incrementally expanding it.
Right. Well, you said that the Ukrainians have been carrying out multiple attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, but Russia hasn't responded in kind. Have they been making any moves on the front line as well, or do you think that they're kind of just pumping the brakes to allow for this educational process to settle in?
I don't think there's any sign that they're slowing things down. Again, we saw a real acceleration through the fall of last year and all the way, into the early winter. And then I think the main thing that happened was the Rasputitsa. There was a very warm January. They had a brief, cold snap again in February, but then it actually became warm again. So, conditions have not been conducive to Russian advances. But the Russian advances, though, the acceleration has stopped that we saw earlier. With the exception, of course, of Kursk, where we saw, again, a real collapse on the part of the Ukrainians. Though it hasn't been accelerated, it still is is considerable. I mean, it's just every day another village or two is taken, and at different points along the line. And, some places like Toretsk that were actually the Ukrainians counterattacked, retook some portion of the city. They've been pushed out, and actually the Russians are expanding from Toretsk. And yeah, they continue to advance along other parts of the line. And yeah, they're advancing too into Sumy, as they're pushing out the final remnants of the force, the Ukrainian force in Kursk. I think they have like maybe one hamlet left. Again, it's just the Ukrainians have virtually nothing there. It just doesn't make any sense to hang on to that one hamlet, but it obviously matters to Zelensky. I think next to his painting of the Kremlin in flames, he had a painting of the Ukrainians advancing in Kursk. In his imagination, this was some sort of great Churchillian achievement of some sort. But so he's not abandoning, but they are being pushed out. And as they're being pushed out of Kursk, and there's very, very little of them left there, the Russians are advancing, making steady advances into Sumy.
We had that this Kursk encirclement where Trump also said that he was talking to Putin, say, spare these people's lives, and then Zelensky was saying there are no troops encircled. Do we know what happened to that? They had a deadline to say to surrender and lay down their arms or be wiped out, and then we never heard anything.
Yeah, I think that deadline expired more than a week ago, and I think it's like that very small force, from what I understand. It's hard to get accurate information because it is a combat zone and it's very fluid, and it's journalists approach that area at great cost. They get information from soldiers, but it may be partial and not entirely reliable. But the reports that I've heard is that there are troops that are essentially encircled. I don't know how many. If we're talking about a few hundred or a couple thousand Ukrainian troops, but right there, on the border. Some of them, within that sliver of land that Ukraine still holds in Kursk, and the others in Sumy. The Russians are attacking from the flanks in Sumy and then pushing directly from Kursk, and there are troops that are essentially encircled. I don't think it's a total encirclement, but it's, maybe for all practical purposes it is. If they turn and try to run, they have to go across fields that are just under total Russian fire control.